I suspect that there are two types of people listening to this message today. There are those who like to thoroughly plan their holidays. Maybe you have an itinerary, maybe you've decided what you're going to do on any given day of your holiday. And there are probably those in the room that like to wing it. Those people who just play it by ear and see what the mood takes them in. Many years ago in my early 20s, I went backpacking around Spain and I bought a ticket into Madrid, and 3 weeks later I bought a ticket out of the country, and everything in the middle was unplanned and unscripted, and it was just see what happens. I'm sure that at the thought of that there are some people in the room thinking that sounds great and other people thinking that that sounds horrendous. Well, today I want to talk to you about a character in the Bible, a well-known person who, without knowing his destination, went on to an epic journey for God. And the verse that we're going to be reading is Hebrews 11 and verse 8. And if you were in Grimsby for the last series we've just done, this is part of the series that we've just finished off. And it says this: by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. Today we're going to have a look at the accounts of this story and specifically highlight 3 ways that Abraham demonstrated his faith. You see, faith is a core part of how we work and how we make decisions. And I think it's really important to look at the example that Abraham sets so that we can build a strong faith core in our lives. You see, I think Abraham's story actually starts with his father, Terah, who lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, which now is modern day Iraq. In Genesis 11, he had 3 sons. He had Abram, Nahor and Haran. And Haran died, and his other 2 sons both get married. And what it says is this: it says that Terah takes Abraham, or Abram as he was called at that point, Abraham's wife Sarai, and his grandson Lot. So this is the grandson whose father Haran had died. And he sets off for the land of Canaan. On the way to Canaan, they stop at a place which I don't think is any coincidence is also called Haran. What we don't know is whether it was already called that, whether it was named after his dead son. But when they came to Haran, which was probably about halfway on the way to Canaan, when they came to Haran, they settled there. Now let's just pause for a moment. I want to ask you a question. Why did Terah settle in Haran when his destination was Canaan? And I think there's probably a few things to consider. Maybe it was comfort. Maybe he was in a familiar place. Maybe it was just a nice place to live. It was probably a logical place to settle down. It was strategic. It was placed on a well-known trade route. Maybe the thought of Canaan, a land that he didn't know and wasn't familiar with, put him off moving into the unknown. And possibly it could have been impacted by his grief. That actually he chose to stay in a place that was named after the son that he lost. For whatever reason it is, we know this. We know that they got partway on the journey and they settled in Haran. Now, it doesn't say how old Abraham was when he travelled to Haran, and it doesn't say how long they stayed there, but we do know that Abraham was 75 years old when he left. And what I want to do is, as we look at this story, I want to share with you 3 characteristics of Abraham's faith. And the first one is this: obedience. Quite simply, the verse says he obeyed. He obeyed God. When God called Abraham to move to Canaan, he obeyed God. The Lord had said to Abraham, this is Genesis 12 verse 1, the Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land that I will show you. And then only 3 verses later, in Genesis 12 verse 4, it says this: so Abraham went as the Lord had told him. So we have this great example of Abraham who was quick to obey God's instructions. I think core faith, which shows maturity, is faith that obeys God. Building a strong core of faith in our lives means obeying God, even when it might not make sense to do so. Maturity in faith means obedience. And in 1 Corinthians 13:11 it says this: when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. And I think Abraham showed maturity. He was no longer a child. He listened to God's instructions. He obeyed God and did what God asked him to do. The second thing is this: movement. Quite simply put, he went. Yes, I think this directly follows on from obedience. If obedience is saying yes, then movement is the outworking of our obedience. If I ask my children to tidy their bedrooms, their obedience says yes. This is great, but unless the yes is followed with movement, that yes might as well have been a no. And I know there have been times when I've asked my children to do something and they've said yes, and then you check in on them an hour or 2 later and the reality is that they've not done the thing that they said yes to. Consider this: the opposite of movement is not necessarily disobedience. It is often apathy, laziness and procrastination. The opposite of movement is standing still, whatever your reasons for standing still might be. You see, if Abraham had decided to obey God, but then waited in that moment, instead of moving, he might have missed the destiny that God had for him. Have you ever been stuck in a place of indecision? Maybe you knew what God was asking of you, but you put off the movement that followed God's ask. Maybe that's the place that you're in now. You see, I think core faith is one that takes action when action is needed. Core faith, quite simply, steps out into the unknown when God asks you to move. Abraham could have settled down with Terah. They could have stayed as a family. They could have had a really nice place to live. But Abraham didn't settle for the place that his father took him to. Abraham made the decision to follow God, to listen to God, and to take action. He pushed on and he moved himself into the promises that God had for him. And I would suggest to you that if you listen to God and you obey God, there has to be a movement that goes in line with that obedience. Because if you don't, you might get stuck in the middle ground and never reach the destination that God has for you. And the third thing that I think we can take from Abraham and Abraham's faith is this: trust. And in Hebrews 11:8 it says, even though he didn't know where he was going. You see, Abraham had been given an instruction by God, but the outworking of that instruction had not yet come to pass. He didn't know what that instruction really meant for his life. Abraham didn't have it all figured out. His father was settled in Haran, but Abraham packed up his possessions. He took his wife and his nephew and he left the comfort and familiarity and he opted to move into the unknown. He left his father in Haran. And in 2 Corinthians 5:7, it simply says this: "For we live by faith, not by sight." There are times when mature faith at the core of who we are means living by faith, stepping into the unknown, rather than waiting to be able to see the destination that God has for you. One of my favourite books is a book I bought years ago when I was at university, and it's simply called this: Bruce and Stan's Guide to the Bible. And this is what it says about Abraham. It says, Abraham is known for his great faith and obedience to God. At God's direction, Abraham packed up his wife, Sarah, and his nephew Lot, and left his home, his friends, and his pagan culture. It was God's plan to set Abraham and his descendants apart from the rest of the pagan world. God wanted a chosen people. Those chosen people would be the recipients of God's law and holy scriptures. They would be an example to the pagan nations of the world. And that chosen people would be the lineage for the birth of the promised Saviour. And I want you to realise that when Abraham moved, when he trusted and when he obeyed God, he didn't know any of that. All he knew was this: that God had given him some instruction to go to the land of Canaan. It was only after he arrived there that God fully revealed his promise and the covenant that God made, the Abrahamic covenant. So Abraham didn't know what was going to happen before he left Haran. Are you waiting for answers before you start the journey? Are you waiting for all the answers? Core faith is a faith that takes the first step even when the second step is unknown. Core faith trusts in God. And in Proverbs 16 verse 9 it says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." You see, trusting in God, trusting is believing. Abraham trusted God by believing what God had said. He didn't fully understand what was going to happen next, but he fully trusted God. And in Genesis 15:6, we know that to be true because it says, Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. So Abraham was called righteous because he trusted God. So what does that mean for us? I think that we have to strengthen our faith core. And what does it mean to strengthen your core? You see, the core is the foundation of who we are. In fitness, core fitness is really important for balance. A strong core acts as a central point of stability for the whole body, enabling efficient movement and preventing falls. As someone who always liked sports like skateboarding and snowboarding and things like that, and mountain biking, a lot of those sports are based on your ability to balance really well. And having a strong core means that you will have stability in your life. And I think we can take that analogy and work on it in two different levels. We can talk about it, how it affects us personally in our own bodies, and also how stability affects us corporately within the body of Christ. And Ephesians 6:13 says it brilliantly when it says, "Therefore put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you've done everything, to stand." Stability based on a strong faith core is so important to our lives. It's important that our lives are built on strong foundations, the core principles of our faith that we have chosen to live by. If we are to live with the faith of Abraham, we must obey, move, and trust. And also for us corporately as a church, it's equally important that our church has strong leadership and strong values at our core. As a church, we need unity, and this means a shared obedience to the will of God. This means that we obey God together as a church. It means that we take action together. I want to encourage you to be a part of the action that follows the faith that we have corporately as a church. Notice that Abraham was given an instruction from God. Sarai and Lot received those instructions from Abraham, and they chose to go with him. I want to encourage you that as your pastors are giving instructions from God, I want to encourage you to move together into what God has, his plans and purposes for us as a church. And the warning here is for those people that don't move. Like Terah, they never got to experience the fulfillment of God's promise. Once he settled in Haran, there was only one more sentence which covers the account of Terah's life. And it simply says this: Terah lived 205 years and died in Haran. Don't be like Terah and settle for the place that is not the destination that God was sending you to. Finally, we need to trust together. We know that God has a plan for our church. Whether you're in Louth or in Grimsby, God has a plan for Generations Church. And in fact, in Jeremiah 29:11, it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." As a church, we all need to trust God in the journey that he's taken us on. We need to take steps of faith together, knowing that God has got us. So as I draw this to a close, I want to share one final thought with you, church. Abraham built altars. Abraham's journey was long. When he set off from Haran, there were various intervals along the way. And at some of these intervals, at quite a few of these intervals, he stopped and built an altar to the Lord. He didn't wait till he got to the destination before worshipping God. He marked what God was doing in the moment, and he offered a sacrifice of worship to God. And I want to challenge you with this: wherever you are on your journey of faith, whether you haven't set off yet, whether you still need to obey, whether you have obeyed, you've said yes, but you've not started moving, whether you trust God for what plans he has for you, wherever you are, whether you've reached your destination or not, I want to encourage you to take time to mark the milestones of the journey that God has taken you on by worshipping him. So as we draw this to a close, mark those moments, and if we're to build a strong core so that we can act with the faith of Abraham, then we need to obey God's instructions. We need to move when God tells us to move, and we need to trust him. And along the way, let's continue to build altars of praise for him.